Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Big Sky Now podcast. I am your host, Josh Amick, with my co-host, John Allen. We're here to break down the matchups that happened last week and also give you a preview of what to expect this week in Big Sky Hoops. So we're going to get right into it with what we thought would be the game of the week. It ended up being a really good game. We got to give love to these Bobcats women's team. They're on an incredible winning streak, 15 straight games. They had a tough matchup with the second-best team in the Big Sky, NAU. And after NAU jumped out to an early lead, we talked about it last week, that switch that the Bobcats team has just to kind of turn things up. They were down double digits, and then by the third quarter, they were up double digits. So, John, watching this game, what did you expect from this Bobcats team and how they performed against NAU and ended up winning the game pretty comfortably?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of just, maybe I didn't expect them to go down double digits like you mentioned, but we mentioned it last week that they have that switch where if they don't want you to score, they'll stop you from scoring, and they flipped that switch and took control of the game, and that's the difference with this Bobcat team compared to every other team in this league is when they need to defensively, they can shut down anybody in this league.
Yeah, they speaking about that defense shutting down, in that second quarter when they kind of flipped the script, it was a 19-8 run. And then like I said, by the third quarter, that lead was all of a sudden double digits. So they just have that script. And one of the things that I thought was really impressive by this Bobcats team as well is Sophie Glancy, the player who's expected to be the Big Sky Women's Player of the Year. The Bobcats held her to 7 points. It seemed like she didn't shoot terribly, but she just wasn't getting a lot of shots. It seemed like they made it a priority to kind of shut them down. The rest of the Lumberjacks beat them, and that was a great game plan. Did you have a chance to see that and see how Glancy looked? Did she look uncomfortable? Or
I didn't get a chance to see it personally, but I was just kind of taken aback as I followed along with the game live. I was out covering Crosstown here in Kalispell for basketball, but I'd check in on X and see the different score updates from the game, and seeing that Glancy was just held in check throughout the entirety of the game. She's one of those players where you just kind of expect her to get hers. She's gonna score points, but when Montana State's able to just hold her, like you said, to 7 points, that's a performance that they need to be proud of, especially with a Player of the Year caliber candidate in Glancy. So Montana State should be proud of that win, and I know that they definitely are.
We're going to move on now to the game they had against Saturday. This was a little more of a Bobcats game that we expect from this women's team, as they won by double digits, 65-44 over Northern Colorado. One thing that really stood out to me is this. I feel like I keep harping it, but it's the defense again. They held Northern Colorado to 30% shooting from the field, 15% from the three-point line. It seems like they have a formula where they have 4 players or more scoring double digits. They prevent you from scoring. Does this team look like a team with already knocking off NAU twice that they're going to run the table in the Big Sky? We talked about that last week, but how are we feeling now after that big win?
Yeah, I really feel like it's a strong possibility at this point. I never want to say it's a guarantee because, games are games, and a bad shooting performance it can lead to anything. But, they've got the hardest opponent out of the way twice, home and away. So with Northern Arizona, and they've shown that they can win those games no matter what the situation is, whether they fall behind early, whether they're just in control the entire way. They've won in every situation so far. So I'd really like to think that they can make it a perfect regular season, go into that conference tournament just with the 2 losses from non-conference. But I will not guarantee it because they still have to play Montana. Rivalry games you can throw out the window.
Those are always different.
So. And they played the first game to a 1-point game, so with the Griz. So it's definitely it's definitely not a guarantee.
Good point. I like they bring that up. I do think if they happen to run the table, they better get some respect, and they better be not one of those play-in seeds in the tournament. They better be one of the at least top 8, top 9 seeds. I think they deserve it if they end up going 32-2 or something crazy like that.
Last week when I was looking at it, they were right in that border of a 13-14. So they're still not getting that respect of an at-large at all. But you see like South Dakota State and teams that they've Florida Gulf Coast teams that they've played and beaten in Florida Gulf Coast that are 2 seed lines ahead of them that have more losses. It's just like, where's the respect for the Big Sky at this point? I understand it's not the top conference, and there's a lot of disparity in women's basketball, but
for sure,
a good team still needs to get that respect, and Montana State is a very good team.
Yeah, and I think if you keep just doubting this team, they're just going to keep proving you wrong, and we're all rooting for them. We're little guys out here in the Big Sky. We think that this team can make a lot of noise in the tournament. We're going to move on to their rival, the Lady Griz. They've been playing some good basketball last couple of weeks. We'll get to the big news later about their head coach officially resigning, but I do want to break down these games that they got into. They beat Northern Colorado. Then they had a tough game with NAU. With NAU, though, they did compete. It wasn't a complete blowout. They held the lead in the first quarter, then things kind of got out of hand. Where do you feel about this Lady Griz team now? Kind of splitting the week. They won 5 out of the last 7. They're still playing good basketball. They're right in the middle of the pack as far as their Big Sky records go. But not only talk about the performance they had against these two teams, but now that you kind of got that cloud of Holsinger finally resigning and Harris is finally the guy, they're handing it over, was kind of looking that direction, but now it's set. Do you think this team can kind of continue their good play and also maybe even play a little better now that distraction is gone?
Yeah, I feel like I honestly feel like since Holsinger left the program, it kind of freed up that play. They seem to be playing a lot freer regardless. So I don't know if it'll add too much more to it because it feels like they've already kind of gotten rid of that maybe extra weight of whatever did happen. I really don't know what happened, and you can't say anything on that. But this team is playing a lot freer. They're shooting the ball. They look like they're having fun on the court, which is a big part of basketball. And I noticed that right away once Harris started taking over. But yeah, I mean, they went out and they beat Northern Colorado, like you said, and that's a game that they should win. Mm-hmm. I feel like this team is finally kind of reaching their potential. They were preseason picked 3rd from both the coaches and the media, so they're still behind NAU, still behind Montana State, but they have that ability to go out and win games, and they showed it for half against Northern Arizona, but that third quarter just kind of put them behind the 8 ball, and you didn't mention this, but the 96 points were the most ever given up by Montana at Dahlberg Arena.
Yeah, I know we talked about that. Yeah,
that's never a good sign when you give up a record number of points.
Absolutely.
But they were still able to put up 76 against a good NAU team, and if they can kind of shore up that defense, if they meet again potentially in the Big Sky Conference tournament, it could be a lot closer of a game.
Yeah, I think they're in such a good spot, not in the best spot as far as the records go, but they're in a good spot with how little games are left. They could easily make up ground and get to that spot that they were picked to finish at the 3rd spot. One of the teams that they are chasing are the Idaho Vandals. They had a good opportunity to move within just a game of NAU, but they split their games. They beat the Vikings, but then lost to Sacramento State, kind of a head-scratcher there. But 3 out of their next 4 games are against teams that are under 500. Do you think that the Vandals team, with how well they've been playing and with the rest of their schedule, it's going to take a lot to change for them not to get that 3rd seed?
Well, yeah, looking at that schedule coming up, I think that the 3rd seed, you'd have to kind of put them as the favorites for it at this point. It's never a guarantee, like we were talking about with Montana State going undefeated. You still have to go out and play the games, and teams will play for pride. Teams will, you could go out and have a bad shooting day on the road, and all of a sudden you drop one to the last place team or second to last place team, and people are starting to ask questions. But you got to think that with a game lead, they're going to be the favorites. Going to be able to pull off some nice wins in the upcoming games with maybe more favorable opponents than having to go up against the Montana States and NAUs.
Yeah, I mean, anything could happen. Like I don't think a lot of us would have predicted that they would have dropped the game to Sacramento State, but they did. So that is going to wrap up the games on the women's side. We're going to move over to the men's side. A very impressive week for the Montana Grizzlies. Got to give love to them. We talked about them with the Bobcats. The Bobcats having their game with NAU. On the flip side, the other game of the week we're really looking forward to was the Montana Griz against Northern Colorado. Battle of the top 2 teams in their respective conferences. And I think Montana came out a little upset about that last loss. They lost by 24 last time. They came out, looked like they were focused. We did talk about how Malik Moore and Money Williams needed to shoot better. They did exactly that. Money Williams had 19 off the bench in that game. I believe Malik Moore was 5 of 7, so he was super efficient with his time. How impressive was this win against Northern Colorado to kind of move them up into a tie at the Big Sky now?
I think it was a very impressive win. I think it was a very big pride win for this team. You mentioned 24-point loss at home. don't like to lose on your home court in general, but you don't like to be run out of your home court like Northern Colorado did to them that first time. So, it's definitely a pride thing in that regard. But just how this team did it, they went out and shot lights out. Plus over 60% from the field, shooting at one point nearly 75% from three-point. They were 10 of 13 at one point in the game. They led this by as many as 21. So, they went out and did to Northern Colorado in Greeley what Northern Colorado did to them in Missoula. Yeah. So I think that was a game that they needed, and I feel like it sets us up for an interesting position if these teams were to potentially meet in Boise now, because they have a 3.5 game lead over anybody else in the conference. They're tied atop at 10-2. Nobody else is even in their area code at this point. Yeah. It's a 1-2 race, and they're both going to end up in those positions at this point, barring a miraculous downfall, which I don't hope on anybody.
Yeah.
And so the Big Sky Conference tournament last year showed us that those seeds don't really matter. Mm-hmm. But if those two teams meet up again in that championship game, I think we'd be in for another great one.
Yeah, I'm curious to see what happens with that because now they're both tied at 10-2. They have the split against each other. So it's really going to come down to who plays who and who plays who where, because a lot of those teams who are fighting for one of the top seeds could definitely pull off an upset. You never know with basketball. You did talk about them shooting 62% from the field. They followed that up against their game against Northern Arizona, and I think they shot 61.5. So they've been hitting on all their shots. But just like we talked about Sophie Glancy, I want to talk about how they held McLaughlin to a rough night. He was 6 of 16 from the field. So it's always good when shots are falling. They're not always going to be falling, but when you can fall back on that defense and shut down a team's best player, it really gives you a good opportunity to win. And I think they did that against their game with NAU, or Northern Colorado, excuse me. Moving on to the Bobcats, rough week for them. They dropped both of their games. They competed well in both of those games. They lost to NAU 69-64. Then they dropped their game with Northern Colorado 73-66. We talked about this a little bit last week, how at this point in the season, these games become big when you're trying to be one of the top 3-4 seeds in the conference. With how they performed last week, do you kind of think that maybe the ship has sailed as far as them getting a top 3-4 seed in the Big Sky? Or do you think with them kind of being middle of the pack, they still can make some ground in the next coming weeks?
Yeah, that's actually a question that I was going to ask for you coming up here after this one.
Okay.
But, you mentioned a rough weekend for them, and it really was. That middle of the pack, though, in the Big Sky Conference is so tight.
It is.
From 3rd to 8th is a game and a half. Mm-hmm. There's 6 teams in there that just have a chance that could end up, being a top seed in matching up or having to play in that first round where, only 4 teams are in that first round. You've got Weber and Sac State who looked kind of on their way at this point, I should say. But, Montana State's currently in that 7th spot now after these losses, and they're tied with Eastern Washington. And so it's not exactly a place they want to be, especially coming into the season, thinking that they could be up there with those top 3 teams and make another run to the NCAA tournament. But I think that, looking ahead with having Idaho State and Weber this coming week, I think those are a couple of games that are really big. Weber State on their home court with how Weber's played this year should be one that gets them back on track. Idaho State's another one of those teams right in that same area as them in that middle ground. So that's a big game that, could potentially see them moving back up the standings. So, yeah, it's just a difficult situation with where they're at right now. And a game like they had against Northern Arizona is one that they might look back at and be a little bit disappointed that they couldn't pull out the victory.
I'm glad you brought that back up because I think when we talked about this last week, we both kind of agreed that the game against Northern Colorado, I don't think a lot of us were picking them to win that game. But we thought that best case scenario for them would obviously be a sweep, but we thought realistic opinions that they would get a split. And then when you drop both games, it kind of could be discouraging, but like you said, it's so tight in that middle of the pack that just one good week of basketball could potentially change things. So we don't want to get too down on the Bobcats. There's a lot of basketball still to be played, and we know what they did last year once they got in the tournament. So it's you can't rule them out so far. But the other team that did you want to say something else?
Oh, I just kind of wanted to hop in here and just kind of get your opinion on what do you think is going to happen with that middle ground? You got those 6 teams all by a game and a half. Who's going to find their way up to 3 and who's going to be playing in that first round?
So I think it's really – I'd have to look at the schedule and see who plays who where, because I think towards that end of the season when games get tighter, there's that much more expectations on it. When the teams that have the home court are going to have a little bit of an advantage, especially in college. I feel like in college it's home court advantage means more than it does in any other professional sport and at the college level. But if I had to pick, I'm still going with the Vikings just because I think they've been doing it at a sustained level this season. And but I do think with them, I think the element of shock is kind of gone with them. I think some of their best basketball may have been in the weeks prior, and they haven't been playing as well lately. We're going to talk about them next. I think NAU has got a good shot too, just because of their balance that they have on the team. I'm a big fan of Isaiah Hawthorne, but I think if I had to pick a sleeper team, I'd go with Idaho State, just for the same reason of NAU, because they have that balance. I'm a big fan of Jake O'Neal and Dylan Darling, I think is his name, the point guard. I mentioned him last week, but I don't know, man. I feel like I'd have to give you a full-blown answer, I would have to see who's playing who. But those are some of my favorite teams to watch. And I think anytime you have a dominant big and a dominant guard play is always, to me, what wins these tournament games, because teams turn up the pressure. If you're not turning the ball over, you got a composed guard. That can usually do a lot of favors for your team, and then you got the big to clean up any of the messes. But do you have a pick on who can kind of get out of that middle ground?
I knew you were going to turn this back on me, and I should have thought about that.
You can't turn on me without it turn on you. You got to have some answers too.
I do think Montana State's going to figure it out.
You do? Okay.
I think that they've got all the pieces there. It's kind of like the Montana women. I think they're just trying to find their right edge right now. Mm-hmm. They had it last year and put it together when it mattered, and I think that they definitely could do it this year once again. So I could see them maybe not getting up to that 3 seed, but I definitely don't think they'll be playing in that first round. And they'll put themselves in a good chance to maybe make that run. On the downside, I'm going to talk very highly of them coming up here soon, but I think Eastern Washington is they're just in a rough spot this season. They lost their coach over to Washington State this last offseason, and they won the regular season conference the last 2 years, but this year it hasn't been adding up for them this year. A couple of great wins over the weekend, which we'll bring up here soon, but I just feel like they're going to be on that downside. As for who's up there towards the top, it's really up in the air, in my opinion, between Portland State, Idaho State, and I think the Vandals got a good chance too.
Yeah.
They shoot the ball better than a lot of teams in this conference, so I think that the King Spud battle could be a big game coming up down the stretch.
It will be, yeah.
And so we'll just have to see how it ends up playing out, but. Yeah, I definitely think it's just kind of a wide open race at this point.
I'm glad you brought up the Vandals too, because I know that the Vandals, I'm a big fan of teams that are balanced, that they're not, they're not a team who can just get hot and then that carries them to wins. I like teams that can get it done on both sides of the ball. The Vandals are one of those teams. I believe they have a top 3 offense in Big Sky and a top 3 defense in Big Sky. So anytime you're that balanced, you're going to be a threat. So let's talk a little bit about Eastern. After, I want to touch a little bit more on Portland State because they deserve love. Still holding down that 3rd spot, but they did kind of have a tough week. They beat the Vandals, but then they lost to Eastern Washington. When you look at the record, you're like, they should not lose to Eastern Washington. But like you just mentioned, they've won 3 straight now. They kind of seem to be figuring out at this point in the season. So maybe that loss, we can look back on it in a couple weeks and say, oh, that wasn't that big of a loss. But do you think the Vikings have what it takes to maintain that 3rd spot, or do you think some of these other teams we talked about are gonna eventually pass them?
Yeah, getting a split on the road is what you want.
Yeah,
in conference play. So I don't think that they look at that weekend as too harsh. And Eastern Washington, they've had the little football rivalry. They play for the Dam Cup and stuff like that.
The Dam Cup.
But it's really hard for me to say because, you talk about home court advantages, and there are some of these places where,
it's
I
not
don't
really
feel like
court.
they don't have that much of a home court advantage because it's maybe not that they don't bring in the fans, but the stadiums aren't, you're not packing in thousands upon thousands of fans, 10,000+, and even places like Montana where you can hold 8,000 fans, it's not going to be full all the time. So you got to make what you can of a home court advantage, and the more home court advantage in this situation is going to be just the familiarity, getting to sleep in your bed the night before, and shooting in the place where you've always shot. So that's one thing that I think Portland State's going to have to really take to their advantage here coming up. But they've got a good chance. I was looking at it. They get NAU and UNC this weekend. So Northern Colorado, never going to be an easy one. Northern Arizona, though, is one that they should be able to take care of business at home. And if you look at some of the other teams around them, you got Idaho State making the road trip to the Montana schools. Idaho's got the one matchup against Eastern this week in Cheney. So, I think like this is a weekend where Portland State, if they can show their mettle and go out there, beat NAU like they need to, and then put in a good performance and potentially knock off the Bears, it's one of those weekends where they could definitely solidify their spot as a top 4, at least, team in this conference.
Yeah, you definitely took the wind out of my sails bringing that in, because that was the transition I was going to go to next. But I think that's a perfect way to sum up this Vikings team. Is going 1-1 on the road is not a big deal, but now you have some really tough matchups. This is a good chance for the Vikings to kind of show what they're made of. That hot start that they had was not a fluke, that they can beat these good teams. But like you said, looking at some of those other teams across the Big Sky, they have some tough matchups too. So even if Vikings happen to get a split against a really good Northern Colorado team, you can't be too discouraged about that. But you do have to hope that a team like the Bengals, struggle on the road, or, the teams I'm sorry, who'd you say was playing the Montana teams?
Idaho State.
Idaho State, yeah, so Bengals, so I was right. So I feel like with as good as Montana's playing, that might be a tough game for them, for the Bengals, but I do think they could maybe bounce back and win against Montana State. We'll get into that a little bit more later, but going over these matchups for the week, we did just touched on Portland State against NAU, the Northern Colorado. Another good matchup. Let's talk a little bit more about these Bengals matchups with the Griz and then with the Bobcats. What team do we expect to show up this weekend in those two matchups with the Bengals? They're kind of right in the middle of the road, 11-11 overall, I believe, right in the middle of the road in the conference. What do you think is going to show up for the Bengals this week against those teams?
Well, I can tell you what their hope is going to show up.
What's the hope?
They hope that the second half that they played against Montana is going to show up for 4 consecutive halves on this weekend. They absolutely dominated the boards against Montana in that second half. They outscored them 50-18. In that second half, Montana led that game by 8 at the halftime and lost by 20. So, it was a performance that Idaho State needs to channel. On the flip side, Montana, like we said against Northern Colorado, they don't want to see that happen again. They got run out of the gym on their home court against Northern Colorado, responded by trying to run Northern Colorado out of the gym. So they need to go out there and put together a game. Idaho State's going to get Montana's toughest because Montana now knows that they're not anybody they can roll over for. Mm-hmm. So that's going to be a difficult game regardless. And then going to Montana State, the Bobcats have been right on that cusp. They've had a lot of close games, a couple of close losses this last weekend. It's just been, the games that they lose, they're not losing by a lot. So Idaho State's going to have to be ready for a fight when they go to Bozeman. And so, it's all about just kind of getting that edge in that first game and then seeing if you can take that advantage onward.
Yeah, that game against Montana State could potentially be huge as far as seeding goes, with both of those teams kind of neck and neck. We're going to talk a little bit about the women's side before we get to our picks. The Bobcats, they got some favorable matchups this weekend. Not like they had last week. They go against Weber State, and then they have Idaho State as well. Any doubt in your mind that the Bobcats maybe play down to their opponent and lose one of these games, or do you think they keep it rolling, get that winning streak to 17, and all good times out there in Bozeman?
I do think that they're going to keep continuing their streak right now. They defensively, they always say, and it's a very big cliche, defense wins championships. We say that in football at the Super Bowl, the Eagles go out and dominate the teams defensively. Yeah. Montana State goes out there and just dominates teams defensively.
Shuts the best player down to 7 points. Yeah.
Yep, and we've mentioned it with that switch that they have, and they don't want you to score. You're not going to score anymore, and so it makes up for when they don't shoot the ball well. Yeah. Too. That's the biggest thing, is that when you have a defense that plays that well, you don't have to be perfect on the offensive end. You can go out there and be human. You can shoot the ball not great, and still that defense is going to at least keep you in the game. Maybe not, even if you don't pull it out, you're going to be close.
Yeah, they have a plus 17 point differential. That doesn't happen by accident. So it's, regardless if they have that switch or not, if they're not shooting well, they still have what it takes to beat a team by having that balanced attack, like I mentioned before, 4 players reaching double figures. Before we move on to the other teams, I do want to give a shout-out to Esmeralda Morales. I did see on X or Twitter, whatever you prefer, I still prefer Twitter, that she was named the Big Sky Player of the Week, so shout-out to her. She had a great week, like I mentioned, in that big game against Northern Colorado, or NAU, excuse me. She had 25 points, so she's been playing great all year. I'm glad that she's getting the recognition she deserves, so shout out to Morales. Moving on now to the Lady Griz. No Holsinger officially. They got Harris back. They're still playing well, 5 of the last 7 wins. They have the same opponents as the Bobcats. Do you think they'll have any issues with their matchups this week? Or what team do you think can pose more of a challenge to them?
I feel like Idaho State's probably going to be more of a challenge. I really think that both the Montana schools will play well, but again, like we mentioned earlier, it's going on the road. Mm-hmm. It's never easy in conference play, especially because you see these opponents before. So, teams can work on things between matchups, but with just how Montana's been playing lately, I really think that they will take care of business. Their only 2 losses in the last 7 have been to the teams above them, Montana State and Northern Arizona.
Exactly.
So, they're playing, like I said earlier, they're playing like the team that people projected at the beginning of the season. They're looking like that 3rd place team in the conference, and I think they're going to continue that form this week.
The other team that we have to talk about is NAU. After they, had their tough game with the Bobcats, they had a pretty good victory against the Griz. This week they got some West Coast teams. They got Portland State, Sac State. Any doubt in your mind that any of those teams can upset them, or is NAU going to get back on track and get to two wins this weekend?
I think if Portland State goes out there and beats them, that's our top story for next week.
For sure.
I think the Vikings.
They got 4 wins on the year, something like that.
and only 1 in conference so far. So that would be a massive upset at this point. I think the same thing with Sac State. Honestly, I know they're maybe not quite as low in the conference standings, but this Northern Arizona team has talent, and they've shown it against everybody, even Montana State, even though they haven't gotten the W's. So Sophie Glancy's going to look to come back out and show her skills once again. So, I don't think anything's going to bother Northern Arizona this week.
All right. Well, to wrap things up, John convinced me that we should get back to what we did in football and give you guys our picks. So, in order to not get these picks wrong, we're going to go ahead and go through them. You want to kick it off, or you want me to kick it off? You finished with the best record in football, or better record than me in football. So, do you want to give us your picks, or do you want me to go first since I always went last?
I'll let you go first. You can have that honor this week.
All right. So let's see if I can improve my record. I do appreciate basketball more than football, so I better not screw this up again. So in my matchup for the men's side of things, we'll break down the women's matchup next week. We're going to try to keep it fair and break down each teams because there's so many games. We don't want to be giving you 40 picks, each week. So we're going to break down the matchups for this week for the men's. I got Montana over Idaho State. I do think that should be a pretty good game, but I do think that they'll pull it off. Montana State against Weber. These are the Thursday matchups, by the way, if I didn't clarify that. I'm going to take Weber to win this one. I think Montana State will bounce back on Saturday, but I think Weber really needs a win. They need to keep their hopes alive for one of the top seeds. So I'm going Weber over Montana State. Portland versus NAU. I'm going to go Portland in this one. I think it will be close. I think NAU will put up a really good fight with the players that they have, but I'm going to pick the Vikings in this one. And then I got Northern Colorado over Sacramento State. That one is just kind of cut and dry for me. I just think that they're the better team. You want to give your Thursdays, then we'll get into Saturdays?
Yeah. So I'm going to go Montana getting their revenge over Idaho State on Thursday. Unlike you, I've got Montana State over Weber. I just don't think the Wildcats have been up to their snuff this year. It's just an off year for the team from Ogden. So Portland State, I think, will get the win over NAU being at home. I think that helps them a lot. And then I've got Northern Colorado over Sacramento State.
All right. So moving on to Saturday, we got the Griz facing Weber State. I think Weber State gets the win on Thursday, but they dropped the game on Saturday. I think with the Griz being at the top of the conference, playing some of their best basketball, they're not going to have a letdown game. They're going to get it done. I got NAU over Sacramento State. Not showing a lot of love to the Hornets, but I just think NAU's going to get the win, especially if things go right and Portland beats them on Thursday. Northern Colorado over Portland State. That has a potential to might be the game of the week. It would be huge for Portland State if they get that win, but I got to go with Northern Colorado, especially with them dropping the game last week. I think they'll be seeing red. This one I was struggling with, but I think for the sake of just being different, I'm going to take the Vandals to beat Eastern Washington. I think Eastern's playing some really good basketball right now, but I think the Vandals, I think they have potential to be top 4 seed, so I think they'll get it done. And then flipping the coin on this one, I got Montana State to get right and beat Idaho State. What are your thoughts?
Well, I also have Montana over Weber State, although I know historically, at least, when I went to school at Montana, I don't weigh any of that into these matchups, of course. But Montana-Weber State games are always close. They're always good battles. Those two teams respect each other all the time, and you're never going to see one of them try to, overlook the opponent.
Yeah, undermining.
But I do think Montana will go out there and get the win over Weber. I also this one I want to change it at the last second, but I'm going to stick with NAU over Sac State just because I think McLaughlin and Tout are going to be too much for the Hornets. It's just I feel like it's going to be a close game though. With it being in Sacramento, the Hornets' nest can be a difficult place to play anytime you go on the road, of course. So I'm also going to pick Northern Colorado over Portland State though. Again, like Josh was saying, I just think that the Bears are too much this year at this point. So for most of the conference, Montana, right there with them. I'm going to go with Eastern to keep up the momentum, get their 4th straight win.
Fair enough.
And take down Idaho. Being at home, I think that, Reese Court is a nice little arena for them. And, with the proximity of the two schools, just a 70-mile drive, you get that rivalry matchup. I think Eastern will keep that momentum up at home. And then lastly, I've got Idaho State picking up the win at Montana State.
Okay. So we're a little flipped on Saturday's matchups, and Thursday we just – I got screwed a lot by picking Weber in football, so I'm hoping it doesn't carry over to basketball. But I'm a big fan of Blaze Threet, so I think he has to have a big game for them to get the win, and we'll see what happens. Montana State kind of muddling right now, but they could easily get right this weekend with the opponents they have. But that's going to wrap up this episode of the Big Sky Now Basketball Podcast. I want to thank my co-host John for joining me. Good luck to all the teams in Big Sky this week. And then next weekend, we'll break down the women's slate and give them love, too. And we'll keep track of the picks just like we did in football to see where we end up. But good luck to the Bobcats. We hope that winning streak reaches 17. Good luck to the rest of the teams in the Big Sky Conference. We'll see you all next week on another episode of the Big Sky Now Podcast. Take care.